So now we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. This is another example of a non-point-to-point communication system in the nervous system. So last time we talked about the secretory hypothalamus, where you have neurons in the hypothalamus that communicate with cells elsewhere in the body by releasing hormones into the blood. But now we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, where it's similar to a point-to-point communication system, but it can be better described as a central part of the nervous system somewhere in the brain that controls networks in the peripheral nervous system, but really the network is able to sort of operate independently. That's what the word autonomic means, meaning that there's some direct control from the brain, but really it's just sort of a general on-off switch that the brain provides, and then the network of neurons in the peripheral nervous system that make up the autonomic system kind of take it from there. And so it's a way for the brain to have to be able to influence the activity of a number of different parts of the body simultaneously, but to not really have fine point-to-point control over those systems. So this diagram kind of summarizes the overall layout of the autonomic nervous system. And also kind of shows how it's different from, say, the somatic motor system, which again is one of those more point-to-point communication systems. So in the somatic motor system, you have neurons in the central nervous system, mostly those alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord that directly connect to the skeletal muscle. So that's where all voluntary behavior comes from. In the autonomic nervous system, you have two populations of cells, one that forms a sympathetic division, one that forms a parasympathetic division, and then those influence ganglia that are in the peripheral nervous system, and then those neurons then have their targets in various tissues and organs, various gland cells that can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. Most of the smooth muscle in the body is influenced by the autonomic nervous system. So this is the muscle that's not skeletal muscle. So that means it's the muscles of the blood vessels, muscles of the digestive system, and so on. So again, muscle that generally we don't associate with voluntary behavior. And then cardiac muscle too. So cardiac muscle is more closely related to skeletal muscle physically, but again, it's like smooth muscle. It's under the control or is influenced by the autonomic nervous system. And like I said, there are two divisions of the ANS. You have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The main difference, or one of the differences between the two, is the location of the neurons of each network. So both divisions, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, consist of preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. So the preganglionic neurons are these neurons. They're the ones that are in the central nervous system, and then they connect to the ganglia that are in the peripheral nervous system. So remember, that's what the word ganglion means. So when we talk about preganglionic, we just mean those neurons that are in the brain and spinal cord that then synapse with neurons in the autonomic ganglia. And so they're both, again, in the brain and spinal cord, different parts of the brain and spinal cord, as we'll see in a minute. But then the neurons that they communicate with are called the postganglionic neurons. Now it's a little confusing because they aren't really postganglionic, they are the ganglia. And so in fact it may be easier or better to say, more accurate to say, that the axons coming out of these neurons are postganglionic fibers, whereas the axons coming in from the brain and spinal cord would be the preganglionic fibers. But that's all that means. It's and both divisions have the same basic layout. You have again, central nervous system neurons that communicate with peripheral nervous system neurons in the autonomic ganglia. If they're part of the sympathetic system, we call them sympathetic ganglia. If they're part of the parasympathetic, we call them parasympathetic ganglia, and so on. Both divisions have connections with different parts of the brain, or different parts of the body. In fact, generally, every part of the body that gets input from one division gets input from the other division as well. And so the two divisions, again, they're anatomically distinct, and they also have differences in what they do. So in the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are largely found in the brain stem, and then some are found all the way down in the sacral spinal cord. And then those neurons release acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. In the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are all found in the thoracic and lumbar spinal cords, and they release acetylcholine also. So that's actually one thing that both divisions have in common, is both the preganglionic, both sets of preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, which actually is something they have in common with the somatic motor system, because of course these somatic motor neurons also release acetylcholine. So all of these release acetylcholine, and in the neurons that come from the central nervous system. But the postganglionic neurons of the two divisions have quite a bit that are different. So in the case of the parasympathetic division, the ganglia, in other words, the neurons that are getting input from the brain and spinal cord, are in or very close to the target organ. So in other words, their neurons may be sort of embedded in the tissue or in the fascia that kind of surrounds the target organ. And then their neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter that they release, is also acetylcholine. So in the case of the parasympathetic division, both the pre and post ganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. But in the sympathetic division, the ganglia are found mostly in a set of structures that are kind of near the spinal cord, but in a collection of ganglia called the sympathetic chain. And then their neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. So that's an important difference. The parasympathetic postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine or noradrenaline. Both of those are just two different names for the same chemical. And then the function of the two divisions is very different also. So generally speaking, the parasympathetic division is more active when the body is at rest. So its responsibility is to activate those parts of the body that are necessary for growth, digesting food, storing excess energy, generating immune responses or supporting the immune system. Again, just generally when you're not really doing anything and you just need to sort of maintain basic bodily functions, the parasympathetic division activates those pathways. The sympathetic division, meanwhile, is active anytime the body needs to very quickly respond to a stimulus, whether that be a threat or something that needs to be pursued. And so sometimes the situations in which the sympathetic division is active is, as your book puts it, the 4 F's: fight, flight, fright, and sex. So meaning anytime that the body needs to very quickly mobilize energy reserves, shut down sort of things that aren't necessary for the short term, so digestion and growth, for example, and increase oxygen levels, increase activity of the sensory systems, and so on. All of those are involved in are activated by the sympathetic division. And then this kind of shows how the different divisions are connected to the body. So pretty much every organ inside the body, all the digestive organs and respiratory organs and most of the circulatory system is influenced either directly or indirectly by the autonomic nervous system. And generally, with only a few exceptions, any organ that gets input from one gets input from the other as well. The only exceptions would be like the blood vessels, for example. So in the sympathetic division, one of the effects of activity in the sympathetic division would be to constrict the blood vessels. So that means activate the smooth muscle cells that that constrict the blood vessels and increase blood pressure. So again, that's something that you would need in a flight or flight response, meaning that you would increase blood flow to most of the body. Meanwhile, in the parasympathetic division, there's no corresponding input to the blood vessels because the absence of input or absence of activity from the sympathetic division would mean that the blood vessels would just be free to relax and increase or lower blood pressure that way. And the other exception would be the adrenal gland. So we said before that the adrenal gland is next to the kidney. And the adrenal gland has two parts, the cortex and the medulla. The sympathetic division, the sympathetic ganglia, axons come in and synapse onto the neurons of the adrenal medulla. So the medulla then releases a hormone called adrenaline. And so adrenaline comes from the adrenal gland. That's why it's called adrenaline. Also norepinephrine. In fact, like it says here, it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epinephrine is just another name for adrenaline. Actually, it means the same thing as adrenaline because, again, adrenaline means coming from the adrenal gland. Adrenal just means next to the kidneys. Epinephrine also means next to the kidneys because one's Greek and one's Latin. Nephros is, I think, the Greek word for kidney. Renal comes from the Latin word for kidney. So epinephrine means next to the kidney, just like adrenal means next to the kidney. But in any case, what that means is that basically the adrenal medulla is effectively acting like a postganglionic sympathetic neuron. It's not a neuron, it's a gland cell, but because it releases norepinephrine just like those postganglionic neurons do, all the ones in green here, you can think of it like a postganglionic neuron. And so it releases adrenaline, norepinephrine into the bloodstream, and again, it sort of reinforces all of these other targets from the sympathetic division. Generally speaking, when one division is active, the other one is inactive, and they have opposite effects on whatever organ they target. So for example, in the pupil, the sympathetic division or norepinephrine in the pupil triggers the muscles of the pupil to dilate, which means they let in more light, and that's presumably to help the eyes see better, and especially in low light situations. Whereas the parasympathetic division triggers pupil constriction, which reduces the amount of light coming in, presumably because it's just not necessary in situations where the body is at rest. In the lungs, the sympathetic division relaxes the airways to let more air in. The parasympathetic division constricts the airways, which means that the airways are smaller and less air is getting in, which again just reduces the activity or workload on the lungs. Opposite effects on the heart. So the sympathetic division accelerates the heartbeat. Parasympathetic division slows it. Now, one thing that's important, it's not like one division is always excitatory and one is always inhibitory. So in fact, if you notice here on the heart and lungs, the effect of the sympathetic division on the muscles, the smooth muscle in the lung, is basically excitatory. So in other words, it kind of increases activity in those muscles, whereas the sympathetic division is effectively inhibitory. Whereas the opposite is true in the heart. So in the heart, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. So in fact, what happens is the lungs, the smooth muscle in the lungs, is inhibited by the sympathetic division and stimulated or activated by the parasympathetic division, because as those muscles are stimulated, they constrict and reduce airflow to the lungs, whereas in the heart, the effect of the parasympathetic division is to slow the heart rate, so it basically has an inhibitory effect on the muscle, whereas in the sympathetic division, it increases heart rate by causing them to become more active. And then same thing, so digestion is inhibited generally by the sympathetic division, but activated or stimulated by the parasympathetic division. Also worth mentioning that all of these organs can operate completely independently of the brain. In fact, that's why we call this the autonomic nervous system, because it doesn't really need direct control from the brain. The heart, of course, for example, beats just fine without any input from the brain, which is good because that means if there's damage to the brain or damage to one of these nerves, the heart can still beat. The only thing the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions do is control the heart rate. So in other words, how fast does it beat? Same way with the digestive system. The digestive system doesn't need the brain necessarily to tell it what to do, but the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions can kind of regulate how fast stuff moves through the digestive system, how much nutrients get absorbed, and so on. Now, again, these, even though they don't really require a lot of control from the brain, they do get input from the brain. Notice too, you can see where the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are found. So in the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are here in the thoracic and lumbar spinal cords, and then the postganglionic neurons are either in these in this sympathetic chain or in other what are called collateral ganglia in various parts of the body. Meanwhile, in the parasympathetic side, you have the preganglionic neurons up here in the brainstem, and then a collection down here in the sacral spinal cord. Actually, the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons, their axons come out as cranial nerves. So the ones that go to the eye, for example, come out through the oculomotor nerve. The ones that come out through the glossopharyngeal nerve go, for example, to the glands that control salivation and tears. And then the rest of the parasympathetic output, for the most part, comes from the vagus nerve. So this is the vagus nerve here. And it has branches that go to the lungs and the heart and the digestive system and so on. And so that's kind of how the vagus nerve, that's why it's called the vagus nerve, in fact, because it wanders. That's what the word vagus means. It comes from the Latin. So that's just, again, sort of the anatomy of the two divisions. But like I said, both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions do have or are influenced by the brain. So this is another role, in fact, for the periventricular zone. So that's part of the hypothalamus. So in addition to secreting hormones through the pituitary gland, the periventricular hypothalamus also has the ability to control the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Again, the hypothalamus's job is to regulate homeostasis. So through all these different mechanisms, through through the lungs and the circulatory system and the digestive system, it can help with those jobs. There's also a structure in the medulla called the nucleus of the solitary tract, which also has a lot of influence over the autonomic nervous system. And then another division of sorts of the autonomic nervous system is called the enteric system, or the enteric division. And this is, again, also under the control of, or is influenced by both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. But it consists of this network of neurons that is sort of embedded in the lining of the digestive tract. So this is kind of a branch of the intestine, and so this is kind of the lumen of the intestine, basically the tube that the food goes through. And then surrounding that, you have layers of connective tissue and then layers of muscle, smooth muscle, that help move food along the tube, and then blood vessels and axons that are embedded in this, again, this mesentery tissue, this sort of fascia that surrounds the intestines. And those neurons in turn control the muscles that again move move stuff along the intestine. Now those muscles again are able to work on their own, but the network of neurons that embeds, and this goes all along the intestine all the way to the stomach, but they help just keep food moving along in a regular order. Again, there's no need for the brain to have any impact on this system at all, except to sort of have an overall increase or decrease in the amount of movement of the intestine. It's a really complicated network with a lot of neurons. In fact, sometimes it's called like the gut brain. It's almost like a whole separate nervous system inside your gut. But its only main job is to just help move food and then eventually waste from along the intestines. But again, this is able to be sort of upregulated or downregulated by the autonomic nervous system as needs change based on the body situation. Okay, so next time we will finish up this chapter with the diffuse modulatory systems.